Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to week two of Demystifying Alphabet Soup of the security acronyms. We're here this week with our industry panel. So last week we talked pretty in depth with Rick about understanding those acronyms, EDR, MDR, XDR, SIM, SOC, SOAR, and really kind of got into how those parts all work together, how they all play off of each other, and reviewing kind of the importance of those acronyms within your security stack. This week, we have a couple of individuals. So Rick is back and joining us this week again to add more information to the wonderful industry panel questions we have. But in addition to that, we have Dave from Thrive. He is their VP of Cyber Risk and Strategy. And we have Thomas from Entirety. He is their Senior Manager of Channel Solutions Architecture team. Dave, Tom, I'll give you kind of a minute to introduce yourself a little deeper. Dave, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Good morning, and thanks so much for the brief introduction there. I'm Dave Sampson, Vice President of Cyber Risk and Strategy at Thrive. My primary role at Thrive is to oversee our consulting group, which specifically helps customers understand current state as it relates to cyber and defines ongoing cyber strategy based on those results. As an organization, Thrive is a global entity. We're about 1,500 people. We have our own folks on the ground throughout the world delivering traditional managed services, but with a very deep focus on delivering next generation cybersecurity risk management solutions. So we are a managed security services provider. We are a multi-tenant cloud provider, and we provide a full set of services that align with the common security frameworks. So happy to be here this morning and to interact on some of the questions that are coming into the panel.
Thank you.
Awesome. So my name's Tom Hood. I'm the Senior Manager of the Channel Solution Architecture team here at Entirety. My role at Entirety is that we are a channel first security MSP. What we're here to do is kind of discuss what we're looking to demystify. I come from the background of having to demystify things for salespeople quite a bit, from working in the VAR world to now in this supplier space. So here to help this make this a nice and easy solution to have a conversation with potential customers with.
And then Rick, for anybody that didn't tune in last week, I'll kind of loop back around you and let you reintroduce yourself if they didn't tune in last week.
Yeah, for sure. Rick Mishka, I'm here with Avant Communications, who is one of the technology sales distributors, TSDs, that works with everybody who's on this call, which is super awesome.
So, well, thanks again, everybody, for joining. We'll jump to this next slide here. This is those same acronyms that we kind of reviewed through last week and took an in-depth conversation. As with our normal format, we received some questions from customers. I've got some questions for these guys. So we bundled them up into a question slide, and we'll just jump right into it. And we'll go from there. So I'll just kind of throw up the first question here. Do endpoint protection solutions alone provide an organization with the protection they need? I'll let you guys kind of speak on that a little bit.
All right, I'll take first crack. Absolutely not. So having that is a key portion of your security stack, but having 24/7 eyes on glass, having some of the other tools like a security operations center, a SIM, to be able to understand what's going on in the environment, along with having people that are capable of doing hands-on keyboard. So as I like to say, my wife always tells me, just because I own a drill doesn't mean I can frame a house. Very similar to a lot of our customers. They'll go out and they'll buy a tool, but they don't really realize how it works. And when we're talking about security, it's not a black and white scenario. So what you need to do is understand what the tolerable risk is. So standalone solutions, in my opinion, in this new day and age, unless you have a very advanced security staff, to lean on folks like Entirety and Thrive and Avail to help you augment what you need in regards to that security play.
Yeah, and I'm happy to jump in and just kind of piggyback off that, right? So it's not just about what solutions you need, but it's also about having the right expertise, skills, and knowledge around those solutions to make sure they're implemented in alignment with best practices. So there's a number of security frameworks that exist, like the CIS framework or the NIST framework. And these frameworks really outline all of the areas you should be considering to truly mitigate cyber risk from an end-to-end perspective. So third-party email filtering, endpoint protection is certainly something that's very important. But other pieces like account management, including password complexity, multi-factor authentication, data recovery, backups, and disaster recovery. What do our solutions look like from those perspectives? Can we recover data if an event does take place? How are we correlating the findings and logs of all of these different solutions to understand trends and patterns that could give us visibility to some larger threat that may be occurring, and best understand how to mitigate that threat? Because that 24-hour monitoring, somebody making sure that they are managing the solution, being responsible for that and for responding, is just as critical as actually deploying the solutions themselves. There's definitely kind of a order of priority that you could consider based on where you might stand today. And that's part of the work that we do through our assessment processes, but you could also do an assessment on your own, just trying to understand, okay, are we covering critical things like endpoint protection, email filtering? These are some of the areas that are very critical, because generally speaking, it's that wrong click from a specific user that starts to cause problems. Those types of solutions can help to mitigate those specific risks, but looking at the larger picture is really what's necessary to do an effective job, and to do a job that really aligns with current best practices and is measured against the current threat landscape.
I mean, I think last week we really focused in on kind of XDR and how that plays a part in really reviewing not just what's happening at the endpoint, but the entire security estate inside of a customer. So it sounds like you guys are in agreement with that, that it really takes a full view of the security suite and the security infrastructure to really have that deeper understanding. So this one I threw in here. I'd be remiss if we don't talk about it with everything that happened. And I've gotten a couple of questions around it, but with the bad publicity that CrowdStrike recently received last week, discussing the recent events of the CrowdStrike outage, if you would. How do you know when it's the right time to reevaluate what's happening at the endpoint? Should customers be reevaluating what's happening with their EDR or their security stack, for that matter, not just the endpoint protection suite? And how would you guys coach somebody through that process of reevaluating what's happening in their security stack?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one first, just because I want to be mindful that this is an opportunity to not only look at your endpoint detection and response solution. If you have CrowdStrike and you're happy with it, yeah, it was a bauble. I'm not defending CrowdStrike. There's a lot of other good EDR technology, but like the other gentleman mentioned, that's a small component. It is an integral component, but a small component of your security posture. And so now you need to think about, well, if I was affected by this, do I need a new EDR? Maybe. But what I need is better patch management, better vulnerability scanning. I need to understand my disaster recovery and backup. So there's more to it than just the EDR, just that acronym. And so I'll leave it there and let the gents here kind of run with it. But that's my opinion, is this showed the value of having a lot more of a posture than just the EDR patch issue.
So I'll piggyback off Rick there, and I will say that 100%, right? CrowdStrike is not a bad solution. Did they bobble? Yes. Everybody's going to have that at some point in time. But when you're looking at reevaluation, you should always be evaluating your security stance. The world changes quite frequently. So just because today you're secure doesn't mean tomorrow you will be. So it's a balancing act. I like to look at when we're talking about any point product or any of these solutions, it's like a teeter-totter, right? What is going to be tolerable for your business? What can you do today to change your landscape? And how do you stay ever vigilant? With the CrowdStrike, yes, that was a big one where they may have bobbled. But where we're looking at it as to reevaluate is to look at what you're doing today and understand the other pieces of the puzzle that you could add in, right? So if you have CrowdStrike and you absolutely love it, it doesn't mean that you have to replace that. But it may be a time to now start looking at, do you have 24/7 eyes on glass, right? Do you have somebody who's monitoring the CrowdStrike to ensure that those logs are being remediated? So when you're really having a security conversation about your environment, it's an ever changing landscape, to be quite honest. And it's because the bad guys are always going through an evolution. They're finding the holes, they're finding the cracks. And what we're here to do is, you don't have to be the researcher for that. We're here to make sure that those holes aren't going to show up for you. So when we're really diving into EDR and how do we take that as a replacement, well, I think it's more of we need to have a full ideology of what you're looking to achieve, because CrowdStrike is a tool. It's a single point product that does something, and it did something well until it didn't do it. So what I always like to look at is, what is the business outcome that you are striving for? And then let's build it back from there. Not everybody needs to have all of the crazy tools, but some of them really can dive into certain things that can evaluate for your business that you may not have thought of. And it may not be replacing the EDR. It may be going to having a SIM and SOC, and now you have that more redundancy for your organization. Or if you really do want to change that over, to Chris's point, then it's maybe time to start looking at XDR to ensure that it's taking in the telemetry from the other tools that you already have. Because security is not a rip and replace scenario. It's how do we build this bigger and better? I like to explain security to my kids like it's like Legos, right? There are steps and processes you can follow. And if you don't, you might have a hole in your Lego. So I think that any time is a good time to reevaluate your current security posture to make sure that you have the right tools, steps, and people in place.
I just want to jump in with a couple of things that haven't been mentioned as much, but kind of just to part of the point that was just mentioned, completing your cyber strategy is never done, right? It's never complete. It's an ongoing initiative. So wherever you stand, you need to be measuring, validating, and reevaluating constantly. My belief is that CrowdStrike will likely survive with a little bit of pain after last week's event. But when we kind of look across some of the events that have happened this year, certainly what we saw last Friday and some very large enterprise organizations are still reaping the consequences of that issue that occurred. The CDK issue, which occurred where the software platform that manages many car dealerships was ransomwared and offline for a couple of weeks, changed healthcare. I'm really encouraging folks to go out and perform a business impact analysis, understand what systems they have that are critical to their organization, the risk that is presented by those systems potentially going offline, and making a plan in advance of how are we going to conduct business in the event that these systems are unavailable. Having that business continuity plan in place will best position you to be able to continue to operate in the event of an outage from one of these platforms, right? So what's the manual process we're going to use? What's the alternate technology we are going to use? Do we have redundant infrastructure, redundant services? What does that look like that will best meet the needs of our organization, as well as our organization's tolerance for downtime, or what we determine to be acceptable for downtime? Because by making those plans in advance and testing those plans, hopefully we can either restore operations in a predictable way or continue to do business through an alternate process that we've already made plans for, tested on a regular basis, produced evidence from that testing, and we are able to really truly understand by the top level holders of risk, whoever the risk manager is for the organization, they've already made in advance a determination that says we know that if this fails, we can continue business. It's going to take us 4 hours. These are the steps we're going to complete, and then we're going to move forward from there. A lot of folks often kind of forget that the ability to predictably restore data is a critical part of the overall cybersecurity strategy. And in those categories come things like managed backup solutions, managed disaster recovery solutions. So looking at those things proactively will be a very good vehicle to success. And when some of these unexpected events happen, it's not necessarily just a ransomware event, but it could be the event that impacts that critical service provider.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, David. I think, in conversations that I've had with customers, it's really, there's a lot of things that drive needing XYZ security application, insert whatever that could be, whether that's SSO or whether that's a VPN alternative. But really identifying less about we need this because of cyber liability or whatever the case may be, and more identifying what are we trying to protect? How are we trying to critically impact business when something occurs by protecting it, I think is an important thing to identify there. And again, like you said as well, there's a reason why there's on that NIST framework, there's that recovery section that I think often gets missed. Everybody wants to identify and protect and detect, but the response and recovery is not the glamorous part, and I think it gets kind of pushed to the side a lot of times. So, we've talked about some endpoint protection suites and things of that nature. I know we've named CrowdStrike here, but specifically because of the organizations that we have on this call with Thrive and Entirety, I often get asked, why would I utilize them over like a SentinelOne Vigilance or a CrowdStrike Falcon? So what considerations should be reviewed when looking at, an MDR through those providers versus like a third-party MDR provider that's doing the managed detection and response versus directly through that organization?
So to kind of jump in on that, right? They do provide some sort of service, right, around the EDR and MDR aspect. But when we're talking about the overall security landscape, it's not just a single solution like SentinelOne or CrowdStrike, because just because you have those, you still need to look at what are the other vulnerabilities within the organization. What are you doing for data encryption? How are you securing your email? What are you doing for, I think the most important thing is, training of your people on what not to click, what's suspicious. So it's really having the ideology that when working with someone like an Entirety and a Thrive, that we're going to come in this and look at it from a holistic point of view, where the tools that we use are industry best of breed, but that's not going to dictate how we look at the landscape of your organization. We're going to look at it from best practices to what else can we do to make it more secure. Where in this case, you can get CrowdStrike Falcon, you can get the SentinelOne Vigilance, and you'll have a service around that, but they're not going to be looking at, well, what are you doing for email? How are you archiving this? What's your data encryption? What are you doing to ensure that you are meeting the compliance you need? They're going to complete the function that you signed up for. And I think that's a big thing that is a mystery to folks, is that they sign up and they get breached. And all of a sudden they're like, well, I bought this service. Well, that service wasn't meant to ensure that you weren't breached. It was a preventative measure to put a blockade to try to ensure that doesn't happen. But when working with Entirety and Thrive, our goal is to ensure that we're aligning with the business outcome for your organization, which is, I think, the biggest differentiator from going to a SentinelOne or a CrowdStrike, is that both of us and everybody on the call from the Avail team is that we're looking at it for how are we going to ensure we're matching the business outcome that you're looking to do. Is that to be more secure? Is that to be, take your risk down? Or is that to hit a compliance need? So understanding that, I think, is going to be the big differentiator for all of us on the call versus going directly with one of those.
Yeah, and one thing I'd also just add in here, right? So, kind of understanding and defining some requirements around best practices for an endpoint protection solution is really going to help to guide you in that process. But my biggest recommendation would be around any solution that you're considering or evaluating is understanding what the business requirements are, but also understanding and being honest with yourself around what the internal skill sets look like around that solution, right? So if we're evaluating third-party email filtering, maybe we're thinking about implementing that ourselves. Do we really have the right skill sets to implement that platform and manage it along with best practices, and then take that data inside a SIM so that somebody's looking at it and they're responding 24 hours a day? So really defining from an internal perspective what your capabilities are, where they start and stop, and then understanding and being honest with yourself about where you're not having those skill sets, the areas where you're really required to outsource, and then measuring those solutions really on at least a quarterly basis. Monthly would be even better, but getting data from those solutions that you understand that they actually are performing the functions that they are supposed to be performing, and they're performing them in alignment with your business. Very often, our customers will look to leverage some type of CISO or vCISO resource to help them with that overall strategy and requirements definition, as well as the evidence review. But making sure that you have the right level of evidence that can be understood at an executive level. It doesn't need to be an overly technical process, but just the right level of reporting that can be digested by various stakeholders will help you get the validation you need to understand you're getting the protection that you're looking for.
Hey, Chris, I'm gonna just piggyback these gents here. One additional thing I want people to understand is SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, you name the endpoint detection response solution, you name the firewall solution, you name the software. It's just that. It's the technology. And a company like SentinelOne, a company like CrowdStrike, they've done a good job of building great technology. And then they realized, hey, if we had a managed service, we can continue to bring in revenue to drive that first principle, which is building and continuously improving that detection and response technology. Thrive, Entirety, and those type of MSSPs, they created the people and process model first. We're there, they're there to really support you from a security operations. And as technology changes, they evolve with it. And so that's the important part. Find the right fit for your organization that aligns with your budget, but also aligns with what your goals are in the future.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think, everybody on this call has probably seen that cyber liability insurance tends to drive a lot of the decisions that customers make on their security stack. So what are you guys seeing new from a cyber liability perspective that seems to be just driving new customer decisions or customer decisions about new security stack? I know we've seen maybe some departure from classic VPN to a more SDP-based solution. That's been something new that I've been seeing from a cyber liability perspective. But what are you guys seeing across your customer base as far as new driving factors?
So this is a fun topic, I will say. I mean, I have actually presented with insurance brokers to kind of understand what they're looking for. And what I'm seeing from the customer side is, a lot of times with cyber liability insurance, it was a nice to have. And your CFO was the guy who was signing the paperwork, right? They were going through, they're checking all these boxes saying, yep, we have all this stuff. And prior to COVID, that was fine. Now, what I'm seeing is that, that fine print, because of COVID, really made the insurance companies take a second guess. And now they want validation of what they're doing, or what the organization they're insuring is doing. So it's not that, yes, I have MFA, or yes, I have a VPN. It's how do you validate that? But I've been also seeing a very big surge in customers and suppliers, believe it or not, requiring customers and their people that they work with to have a certain cyber liability insurance. If they want to continue doing business, So, for example, in healthcare or in manufacturing, their suppliers are making sure that they are secure. So, I'm seeing a lot more of that adoption of, well, we said we had this for a very long time. How do we actually do it? Or I turned on Microsoft Defender, but it's not configured. So one of the big things that I think that has been driving it from my side is, you know, do I have things configured correctly? Do I have the right policy? Do I have the right tools so I can adequately check this box? But it's being driven from multiple different angles, from customers saying they want to only do business with secure businesses, which is fine, right? Think about it in that case. And then you also have the supplier side where, let's say that you're a paper manufacturing company and you're selling paper to, the government. And now they're requiring a certain level there. And they're like, wait, I just make paper. But it doesn't mean you're immune, because the one thing that I've seen the major trend is no matter what industry you're in, you are a target. And the goal is to make yourself a least target, which is why cyber liability insurance has been getting even more granular, to your point, Chris, of making, the changeover from a VPN to something like an SSO or an SDP solution to even as deep as a SASE solution, right? All of those things, they're looking to minimize risk, and it's really what you look at internally for your own organization of what is your tolerable risk and then what is your actual risk. Because the tolerable risk that you think that you have, by going through a cyber liability insurance questionnaire, it's going to make you really look at what you're doing, to ensure you don't have any holes. And that's what I've been seeing, from all over, from all industries. It's really making them understand what they're doing today and why they're doing it.
Yeah, the other piece I'd add is that, from the perspective of the underwriters for those insurance policies, in the event that you misrepresent what you're doing in those questionnaires, in that evidence gathering process, and then an event does occur, if they determine during that event that you've misrepresented the protections you have in place or the implementation of those protections, et cetera, they'll basically invalidate the policy. So they're not going to provide you with any type of payout or support, any of that assistance. So where it used to be a situation where basically insurance companies are trying to sell cyber insurance policies, people kind of filled out the right answers on those things, and the insurance companies got plenty of free money, and they didn't have to pay out as often because the attacks were not as frequent as what we see today. This was kind of not looked at the same way, or certainly as seriously. Now the stakes have changed. So if you want that policy to be enforced and to be something that actually does in fact help you, you do need to make sure you're doing the things that are being asked, and they are asking impressively deep and detailed questions, in my opinion. But I think the other thing that was mentioned that's very important is third-party risk, right? So regardless of who you work with, either from a customer, supplier, vendor perspective, third-party risk is very important to measure on an ongoing basis, really at least annually. So whoever those critical suppliers are to your organization, how are you understanding how they are protecting their environment, right? If you're giving them data, is the data that you're giving them about your customers, your intellectual property, is that being protected? Are they able to continue to deliver product to you on the schedule that's needed, or are there risks within their infrastructure that are something that could present risks to your organization, because their risks ultimately become your risks? So doing some type of diligence process around that, and I would expect that there are likely folks on this call today that have received those inbound DDQ sheets that everybody loves. They're often in Excel, sometimes through a web form. They have like 100 questions, and people generally don't want to deal with them. But they are very important, and it's something that should be considered as an outbound function for yourself as well, once you identify who those critical parties are.
Yeah, and just something to piggyback off of that, I know one of the acronyms that was on that document, that that previous page that we showed, was IR, and I think that's an important one, David, to piggyback off of what you said. A lot of times the cyber liability insurance providers are very quick to bring in their incident response vendor, but I think everybody on this call would agree that that incident response vendor probably not there for the benefit of the customer. Normally, they're there for the benefit of the insurance provider to find a checkbox that was improperly filled out on that cyber liability document, or to put scrutiny on, you had 2FA on all your admin passwords. We found one that isn't 2FA. I'm sure you guys see that all the time.
Unfortunately, yes. It's to your point, when IR comes in, it's not to resolve it. It's really to make sure that you did what you said you were going to do. They'll come in there under the premise that they want to resolve it, but they're really looking for holes, to be honest.
Yeah. So, along those lines, how are you guys? There's been a big conversation around ZTNA, and I know a lot of people. I think there's some kind of confusion in the industry around, is ZTNA a product? Is it a process? Is it a mindset? Is it all the above? But how are you guys helping customers navigate that ZTNA journey to zero trust? Because it's a sliding scale. It's, there are plot points on a graph that you could really plot out to say you're moving towards a zero trust network access model. What do you guys do from that perspective? How are you helping customers with that journey or navigating that journey?
So to jump in, right, when somebody asks me for any acronym, whether it be SASE, VPN, ZTNA, right, the core is, what are they trying to accomplish? Now, when we're talking about the zero trust network access, right, I do find that a lot of people get confused, that they're like, I need SASE because that's a buzzword, right? They see it on the marketing and they're like, oh, it's better than ZTNA. But they don't understand that zero trust is the core of where you start with SASE. So what we're doing is understanding, what are they looking to accomplish, right? Because I've had conversations where a customer starts off as, we need to buy this ZTNA thing, and this zero trust network is exactly what we need. But in all actuality, they were really asking for a single sign-on. And that's the part that's really tough, is that these are all great solutions, but whenever we start getting into the acronym soup of security, my underlying point is really to understand what you're trying to accomplish. Don't start talking about technologies and how to do it. Understand what you're looking to accomplish, because ZTNA is a great solution, but a lot of companies, it's overkill, and some companies it's underkill, right? You need to go with a full SASE, where you have a cloud access security broker, where you have a secure web gateway, right? And you have all of these more robust states. And that's where we're helping customers navigate that journey, is to making sure that it's not overkill today, but you're not going to outgrow it like my son does with his shoes in a couple weeks, right? So we want to make sure that we understand where they are, and we have all of the capabilities to do something as robust as ZTNA to bring them to the next step of their journey to a full-blown SASE solution, which is the next buzzword I've heard all over the place, that customers unfortunately don't realize that there's so many moving pieces to it. So it's really helping them understand where they are today and where they're looking to go in security, because anything that's a more advanced solution like zero trust network access, you really want to understand what is the thoughts behind why they're doing it. Because a lot of times I've gotten into conversations that their CEO said, we need this. And the IT director was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Like, I don't see the benefit. I don't see the value. And that's where we can help, between us, Thrive, you, Chris, right? To demystify what they're actually asking for versus these really cool acronyms.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that you mentioned that makes a lot of sense really is the identity management, or the single sign-on, right? So identity management, everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of folks will view something like single sign-on identity management as a convenience factor, but it's more than just a convenience factor. It's about enforcing the same security requirements, multi-factor authentication, password requirements across all of your enterprise applications. It's about having single points of control for what users have access to what resources, being able to disable those users, being able to take data out of those platforms and view that within your SIM, SOC, SOAR platforms to take action, so that when that user starts to log in from a unexpected geographic location, somebody can take a look at that, connect with that user, take whatever actions have been defined. So that's going to become, it is critically important today, but it's going to continue to become increasingly important as time moves forward.
So, David, I know earlier you had talked about assessment and measuring yourself against a specific framework or something along those lines. But with everything going on, what do you guys see as the best way for customers to measure the current state of where they are with either cyber protection or security, however you want to mention it, but kind of all saying the same thing. But what's the best way that you guys have seen for customers to start to measure that? Even, I would say, self-evaluate before they get involved with a Thrive or an Entirety, to really come to you guys with a clear, concise, here's where we are. We don't know where we want to go from here, but here's a baseline of where we are today, and maybe some sort of compliancy that they need to get to.
Yep. And I would say, regulatory compliance, new regulatory requirements are a very big driver for folks to enforce or boost up their security posture in general. So whenever new regulatory requirements come out, there's usually an influx of folks that are trying to do new and additional things. But my best suggestion really is to find a security framework. If you haven't adopted a security framework for your organization, find one that makes sense. I often recommend the CIS because it is easy to understand, covers all the basic areas. It's also very easy to translate to other frameworks. A lot of these frameworks have 85 to 90% of overlap. There's just minor differences between them. So once you start to align with a single framework, it's generally easy to align with other frameworks as well. But a lot of these folks, and CIS being a good example again, will kind of give you some steering around how to do that self-assessment and inventory and look at those control areas and see what you're doing, right? What solutions do we have? Are they implemented appropriately? Can we collect evidence from them to really understand what they are doing today? Does that evidence exist? Do we have the right expertise in this particular solution? Is the provider that we're working with, do they have the right expertise? Reviewing the evidence supplied by them. Those are the types of steps that you really want to take as a step one. A lot of folks will look towards penetration testing maybe as a test of their security, but I often will have conversations and help to try to understand what current state looks like. If you're not doing things like vulnerability scanning, remediating vulnerabilities, patching Windows systems on a proactive basis, and not just from the perspective of we're patching our Windows systems, we have them all set to patch and people are rebooting on Tuesdays, because if we can't produce evidence, we can't believe that it's true. So I don't usually believe that anybody's rebooting ever unless we can produce a report that demonstrates that those patches have been installed, right? But if we're not doing some of those steps, which what I would call the basics, I can tell you today that your penetration testing investment will produce results that you don't want to see, and they're not going to be as actionable. So doing some type of an assessment process makes a lot of sense. Get your house in order, then something like penetration testing could be considered. At the same time, in certain cases, depending on your vertical and your regulatory requirements, penetration testing might be something that you're required to perform at least annually. And regardless of if your house is in order or not, you're going to need to do that. But in an ideal scenario, we want to make sure that we're doing some of the right steps before we go make that larger investment in a pen testing initiative.
So I'm definitely in agreement. And the one thing I will add, though, is that I get a ton of requests for penetration testing. And my first rebuttal is why? Simple, why? And a lot of times it's, I need my house in order. So it's one of those times where I think an assessment is also a great way to start to understand where your gap assessment is. But to add on to the penetration testing, just doing an initial penetration test to see where your holes are it's going to hurt to see the holes because you always want to say, my ship is great. But where I think a lot of people kind of lose it is that they try to fix the holes, but then they don't do any validation to ensure that those holes were corrected. So when you're doing a penetration test, it's one of those where you start there and you understand it and then you remediate it, but then you got to test those things because, like I say, theory is one thing, practice is another. And that's where I think a lot of customers get a false sense of security when just doing a penetration test versus penetration test, remediation, and then doing it again.
Right. And I would say so traditional penetration testing generally leverages the skills of a certified ethical hacker. That's what's happened traditionally. They'll do some scans, they'll try to find vulnerabilities that exist that they can exploit within the environment. And to that point of validating remediation steps, we actually started delivering pen testing services about 18 months ago through autonomous pen testing. So there's pen testing tools that exist now that are very good. They generally meet the mark and meet the requirements of pen testing by regulators, but they are software based. Any pen test that you perform is really the results of that are as good as the day it occurs. So as soon as a new vulnerability exists, as soon as you start making changes to the environment, you've basically invalidated your pen test results. You no longer know if those results are accurate. The advantage to these autonomous software-based solutions is that you can retest almost as frequently as you like, depending on the scenario. But in the example of we remediated these findings, well, let's go run another test to find out, did we really remediate them? So we have that evidence. Or perhaps new vulnerabilities have been come out, we've made changes to the environment. Let's retest to find out where we stand now. And typically these tools will have native functionality to compare the results of those tests over time. So they're extremely powerful. They've been very popular. They're also cost, I'm going to say generally like 50% less, 2/3 of what a full-blown traditional pen test would cost. So it's a cheaper vehicle to pen testing. Very, very verbose, very, very good data outputs, very, very good findings and defined actions from those types of solutions.
And David, to even piggyback off of that a little bit more, I've seen organizations use those automated solutions as almost like a change management part of their change management process as well. So that automated pen test, they make a firewall change, they make an adjustment to infrastructure, they run a pre-flight and a post-flight pen test to see if an accidental any role has been enabled or anything along those lines. So they use it as part of their change management platform as well, which is pretty powerful to make sure that human mistakes, human errors happen. As much as it happens at the endpoint where somebody makes a wrong click, it also happens at the infrastructure side of things where somebody accidentally pokes a hole in a firewall that shouldn't be there or exposes a system publicly that shouldn't be exposed, things like that. So kind of leading into that, I think a lot of us on the call would probably say it's not a matter of if, but when an organization is going to have a cybersecurity incident. What are some of the best ways for organizations to be prepared? I know we've talked a little bit about this, but you guys have mentioned, tabletop exercises and that vCISO services or CISO services. So, what are you guys seeing as the best way for organizations to be prepared for these incidents from the documentation side and from the actual action side?
So to lead into that, I think that one of the most overlooked things in security is disaster recovery. And I will argue with anyone if they think that disaster recovery is not part of cybersecurity, because to your point, it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. How do you have a business continuity plan? And in my personal opinion, I am not a fan of tabletop exercises. And the reason being is, Dungeons and Dragons as a tabletop doesn't mean it's real. And when an event actually occurs, the goal is that you want to ensure that your production environment fails over seamlessly. So what I like to do is help them understand, one, disaster recovery. What is your business continuity? If this particular building literally catches on fire, what is your COVID strategy, as I like to call it nowadays, right? Since we were all forced to adopt it, how do we go from our four walls to working remote? Because, just because the building itself is burning doesn't mean business stops. And that is, I think, the biggest thing to have an organization understand. And I think, healthcare went through that, right? With telehealth 5 years ago, that never really existed. COVID happened. They got forced to adopt it. They got forced to do all these crazy security things, right? Because it was lax. So I think the number one thing for an organization is A, you want to go be secure, but B, always have a business continuity plan, even if it's a basic one. If you don't have some sort of idea of when the bad news rolls in the door, what are you going to do? Think about it as a car. You don't want a flat tire, but you always know that there is a flat tire that comes with the car. I mean, a brand new spare. And the same thing should be looked at for a business is you got to make sure that you have your spare tire on hand and you're able and willing to be able to transition into it, and not just say, in theory, on paper, it looks like I turn this lefty loosey, righty tighty. This is actually how it's going to happen if this does happen. And that is, I think, the biggest misconception for a lot of companies is that they have a false sense of security by just going to the cloud or going to, this solution. They really, no matter if they're in Azure, AWS, multi-tenant, virtual private, they need to have a business continuity plan. And I think that is the biggest part, to have a good response to when a security incident does happen, when it happens.
Yeah, and I just, to your point there on the tabletop exercises, the majority of disaster recovery solutions that exist today, certainly the mainstream ones, will allow you to do testing, failover, not impact production operations. If we kind of think back to the old school of tapes and such, and things that really weren't very predictable, even with backup solutions, validation, we want to test the restoration of some data, even with current solutions. But those disaster recovery solutions allow you to spin up what has been replicated, understand and do user acceptance testing to make sure that the data that is within your enterprise applications is current, and those types of steps, so that without question, that you are getting the protection that you are looking for. But the other piece to this really is that incidents will happen, right? Everybody's a target. If you want to stop being a target, I suggest you disconnect from the internet entirely, or any outside network. That's not a reasonable or realistic step for the majority of folks, but regardless of who you are, the size of your entity, what vertical you're in, the threat actors are out there. They're just scanning, they're looking for opportunities, and they're taking over those opportunities. So really starting to understand what a strategy looks like for your organization if you don't have one, investing in that strategy on a proactive basis, which generally is a much more manageable and predictable cost than the reactive basis, which is very expensive and very unpredictable. Also brings additional consequences with it, like brand reputation damage, interruption to business operations, etc. So you really want to take that proactive approach, make some investments that are manageable and much more easy to swallow now than getting yourself into a situation where you're running a big fire drill.
And I'm going to jump around a little bit because I want to get to this last question here. So if we have time, we might go back. But internal security team or like an outsourced MSSP SOC, what considerations should be made when reviewing these options? I know maybe a little bit skewed of an outlook here with the providers that are on the phone, but I have customers every day that are evaluating, should they build that internal team out? Should they find those resources? I know people will say find those resources locally, but I think post-COVID, depending on the business strategy, I think that local ring is expanded out to be a little further. But how do you work with customers and kind of review when it makes sense to do this internally, when it makes sense to utilize an outsourced model?
Yeah, so I'll jump right in there because, when it comes to developing a security operations center, the things that a lot of people aren't really thinking about, it in practice, it sounds great. In actual delivery, it means you actually have to have sets of employees along with spares, because people get sick, that can monitor your environment 24/7, 365. And I have customers who have very skilled hands, but they can't replicate that person to run 24/7. So what I like to look at is, what is the talent do you have on staff? Because it doesn't mean you need to fully outsource. You can utilize someone like Entirety, where we will do your eyes on glass. We'll see an alert. And for example, Chris, you are okay with waking up at 2 a.m. and have the skill set to go hands on keyboard and remediate it. Now, where we have that conversation is, what skills do you have internally? And sometimes those people don't want to do that. Other times they do have it. So it really comes down to the talent pool that they have. But what I've seen is the peace of mind of having somebody watch your environment 365. It's really the best way I can describe it is how one customer kind of went, all right, this is how I'm looking at your security operations center. Option A, you call me and tell me to go get a fire extinguisher, and I put the fire out myself. You let me know my house is on fire at 2 a.m., and I put it out. Option 2 is to work with somebody like us or Thrive, is that our security operations center will call you, let you know that, hey, your house was on fire, we put it out, and we already went through the rebuilding process. This is just hey, letting you know what happened, okay? And that's, I think, what a customer really needs to validate on their side. And it's a hard truth that they need to realize, that they may not have the talent. They may not have the talent in the area. And that's where I think a lot of them are really starting to see the value of going to us, because once we start doing that, we then can start bringing in other telemetry that they may already have, or they may be looking to go to, because it does open up so many other avenues for them to see what's going on in the environment. And I think that's a big thing for them also, is it's an unbiased opinion, good, bad, or indifferent, when we're looking at your environment and those logs, that we're not going to hold any punches where somebody internally may be like, ooh, we may not want to bring this to our CIO. We're just going to fix this right now. And that could lead to a bigger problem. So it's immediately reducing risk for the organization by outsourcing it, in my opinion.
And I think
unless you're, sorry.
I was going to say, I think one of the things to think about as well is not just, do you have the resources on site and can they do it, but also, could they be used more strategically than day-to-day eyes on glass too? That's another thought process there, especially with smaller teams. And yeah, sorry about that, David.
No, it's okay. But the other factors here really are, right, 24/7 availability. So, generally only the largest enterprises actually have the budget to staff something like that. Maybe, a pager-based system is acceptable, but beyond all of that, you need to have the technology and the SIM solution in place that is prepared to receive that data. You need to have the skill sets to configure your solutions to interface with that platform. If you want to add a store capability, are you going to make the investment to develop that? So working with a third-party provider, these platforms exist, right? The people exist, the platforms exist. Also, the correlation of data that is coming in from these platforms that allow the most effective response and the fastest response. It's very difficult to match that for many organizations, because I know, at least at our organization, millions and millions and millions of dollars have been invested just in the platform that sits behind what our SOC engineers are looking at, right? We have SOC engineers 24/7, multiple geographies, all of these different factors. We also have the ability to ingest data, not just from the solutions we provide, but we can ingest data really from on-premise solutions, third-party solutions, et cetera. I talk to a lot of customers and will identify, usually through an assessment, these are the steps you need to be taking around security. And sometimes the customer will say, well, we're going to hire a security resource, and that is going to solve this problem for us. It's a very short-sighted strategy. Strategy is probably the wrong word, right? But that single resource is not going to be able to be a 24/7 SOC, deploy a wide variety of risk mitigating cybersecurity management solutions, et cetera, right? We need to be, as said previously, very honest with ourselves around what is realistic, what the skill sets are, what the availability is, what the risk is to the organization, and the best way to approach mitigating that overall risk that it's going to be the best spend of our money, of course, from a budget perspective, but really also just provide us with the protections that we need.
And I can make it even simpler. These guys killed it, but it's as simple as this. You can hire the right people, but if they don't know how to build the process around the technology and what you're actually looking to do, you've missed the mark. And so Thrive, Entirety, these MSSPs, they've built that process. They know what it looks like, and they're continuously improving it. And I think that's the difference.
Well, with about a minute left here, I want to say thanks to everybody on the call today. If there is any questions that anybody has based off of this, please feel free to reach out to your technology advisor, reach out to myself. More than happy to have any of these individuals on another call with you directly. I can speak with you and we can find the right solution to fit any of the questions that came up today. Thanks to the industry panel again for joining us this morning and talking some security acronyms.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Have a great rest of the day.
Have a good one, everybody.